European Championships continues to throw up some interesting words and interactions. Not so good for Arsenal, however, as a big blow potentially to their potential incomings this summer. We'll talk more about that. We've got a transfer target to discuss and plenty of your questions to answer too. This is the Arsenal Transfer Show. Hello and welcome to the Gooner Talk, back again with you guys and girls for another episode of what is the Arsenal Transfer Show. Joining you every single morning at 8 a.m. UK time. Thank you as always for joining me and making this a part of your morning routines. It's incredibly appreciated. I hope you've had a fantastic week so far. It's nearly the weekend. Thursday. Thursdays are good days. And of course it is England Day, with England taking part in the European Championships. They'll be facing Denmark, Christian Eriksen and co. The early kickoff today, Slovenia against Serbia, and the later kickoff, Spain against Italy. So some really interesting battles and tussles in the groups today. Looking forward to that game, particularly tonight against Spain and Italy. That's going to be very, very exciting, hopefully. But good morning to those joining us live in the chat box. Good morning to Steve, Blackshine, Pikahu, Errol, Olawale, Rich, Paul. We've got Damien and Blackshine, Stevie, Shari, Roy, Emmett, Barry, Elder, Joey. We've got Z and Grantley Poos, Tom, James, Wayne, Aiden, and plenty more of you guys and girls as well. Thank you for tuning in. That is incredibly appreciated indeed. And if you haven't already dropped a like on the video, that would also be massively appreciated. Yesterday, you utterly and entirely smashed it. We got over 1,800 likes on yesterday's show. And of course, we got up the day before, well over that 1,000 target too. So we can't rest on our laurels. We can't be too arrogant about it. We need to keep pushing. So make sure you drop a like on today's video as well. And thank you for those that hopped over as well from our audio platforms. There are a few nice comments left from our Spotify and Amazon Music and iTunes listeners as well. So thank you to you all for tuning in and helping us out in our big push for the continuation of our 1,000 like challenge. Right, let's go into today's story, shall we? We start with the bad news. And that came in Scotland's 1-1 draw against Switzerland. Kieran Tierney taken off on a stretcher during the game with what looked to be a pretty serious injury. Steve Clarke, the Scotland manager, speaking after the game, said he's definitely out in regards to being asked of the next game and potentially Scotland's last game in the tournament. It looks pretty bad, he said. So we have to assess it, but Kieran won't make that next game. He's a top player for us, does ever so well. It's a shame, but someone else has got to step in and step up to the mark. Very bad news for, of course, first of all, Kieran Tierney. Really horrible to see any player have any significant injury. It could be, I don't really want to speculate about what it is because we don't have the details yet. It could be anything. But a player that could have earned Arsenal quite a lot of money, upwards of £10 million this summer. Sadly, it could be one that rules out a summer exit, which means, interestingly, I guess what it does do is it opens up an interesting scenario where if a summer transfer is ruled out and he stays, does Kieran Tierney suddenly become an option for Arsenal later on in the campaign, which is ironically something that I know a lot of fans have wanted to see, but equally many have been pretty critical of his European performances this summer as well for Scotland, and that his performances for Scotland weren't necessarily doing loads to his value. But a big blow to potentially a sale of Arsenal this summer. William Saliba is also said to be dealing with something of a minor ankle issue. Of course, Saliba started in France's 1-0 win this week as they kicked off their hopes of winning another major tournament. And with Saliba now a starting centre-half, Didier Deschamps confirming that he also has suffered something of an issue, although it is only said to be minor, and there's no suggestions at the moment that he'll miss the next game for France, but certainly another injury scare and brings the reality home about what Arsenal perhaps need to do in the transfer market to bring depth to their centre-half positions. And I think obviously that relates quite nicely into one of the transfer stories we're going to be discussing today. But just before we do, Gabriel Martinelli taking part of the Copa America, of course, this summer for Brazil. Didn't have the best of seasons, I think we can all agree, for Arsenal. It wasn't his best season, and he struggled to get regular establishment at the second half as Leandro Trossard kind of forced him onto the bench. And he says, I'm going to work hard to make it happen in regards to having his best season so far next year. I'm going to do my best to get the best possible version of myself at Arsenal. I hope to help my team with goals, assists, and good performances. It seems that he is all too aware of kind of where he's at as a player right now and what point he's at as a player in the season, of course, that he's just had. He still did enough to be able to, compete and play and get into that Brazil squad for the summer, as opposed to someone like Gabriel Jesus, for example. But it does seem that he's all too aware of where he's at as a player and what he needs to do moving forwards to get better and to establish himself again in the Arsenal first team. And our headline story of the day, in what has been a quiet 24 hours, numerous reports are linking Arsenal with Marc Guehi, the England defender, Crystal Palace defender. As I said, that injury scare for William Saliba that we just touched upon doesn't seem to be too serious, but it certainly does bring into the fold the reality of what an injury can do, and you can lose players very quickly. And having some quality competitive options, and I look at Guehi as definitely one of those competitive quality options. He's an England starting centre back during this tournament, and he's certainly proven to be very good. Price tags though aren't coming cheap. Palace is said to want upwards of £50 million to sign Marc Guehi from them, but he would represent a Premier League ready, homegrown, very, very good Premier League level centre half. So if Arsenal were to go into the market for a player, Guehi does stand out as a potential one that would fit that mould. Now, but before we move to Mark 2, we can go to Mark 2. But before we go to part 2, I want to tell you about tonight's tribute show on the Highbury squad to Kevin Campbell. I'll be joining Sophie and friends at 10 o'clock tonight. The show starts, though, at 9:45. There'll be messages from lots of familiar faces and friends of ours at the channel as well, some former players and colleagues of Kevin's. And it'll be just a lovely evening after, of course, all the European Championship games have come to a conclusion. So we're not crossing over with the England game or the Italy-Spain game. So it's going to be after all the football has taken place. So if you're here in the UK, maybe it's something you can watch while you're chilling in bed. For those elsewhere in the world, I hope it's something that you can also tune in for. So that's tonight, 9:45 p.m. UK time. So make sure you check your time zones of when that's going to be on the Highbury squads. I'll make sure to leave a link to that, as of course, in today's video description as well, so you can schedule it or set an alarm for whenever you need to and have the link ready as well. So after the show's finished live, you'll have a link in today's video description. And of course, I've retweeted that as well, and I will retweet that again, so you can make sure that you are all across it and you'll be joining us. It'd be great to see the TGT family represented in the chat box throughout that show. So I look forward to seeing many of you there. Well, let's go to part 2 and your questions right after this. Right, part 2 of the show. This is where we go into the chat box and take as many of your thoughts, questions, queries, theories, and thoughts as we can. And we're going to start with this very simple one from Jason. Just says, would definitely take Guehi. So it seems that this is a player that is, interesting that people are more open to it. Ehi says, I will take Guehi in a heartbeat. He will raise the level of our game and would be a massive player for our squad depth department as well. Amira on the Kieran Tierney news says, honestly, business aside, you can't help but feel bad for him. It gets to live out his dream of being a footballer, but it's seemingly forever affected by injuries. And of course, he is not the only player, that is affected by this. And loads of players go through significant injury problems constantly. Yaya says, Tierney is why I'm sure offloading Smith Rowe is the right decision before his value lowers further. I love KT, brilliant player, but we've been through it with Jack and Diaby and Eduardo and Rosicky as well. Some very good examples of other players, of course, who've suffered considerable and persistent injuries throughout their time with Arsenal. Cam reckons that Tierney is going to be released on a free at the end of this season. Gooner Millsy says, at this point, we have reached with Tierney. I didn't expect much over £5 million anyway, and it does seem to be that is where we're at when it comes to players like Tierney. They're not going to get as much. Izzy says, how long will Tierney's recovery take? We don't know, because we don't have the specificity of the injury at this moment in time. The specifics are still unknown to us. So when we have that, we'll be able to talk about that in a lot more detail. James says, probably unrealistic, but Musiala would be a dream signing. It would be a dream signing, and that's why dream signings are indeed unrealistic. It's not usual that we get those. And I don't expect Bayern to sell him. It seemed there was reports suggesting they'd be open to letting him go or he'd be open to leaving, but Bayern would be mad to let Musiala leave. Amruganis says, Tom, I used to love watching England in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now the interests I have in the international football is hoping our players don't get injured. It does seem the English kind of, not even English scene, the international scene of football it does take a backseat. But I think more so perhaps in England than anywhere else. I can only speak really from an English perspective. The England national team has always been, as I remember it, a distraction, if anything. And I think a lot of people have lacked that connection with the England national team because of how boring some of the games can be, how uninspiring England can be. And even though we've been relatively progressive in getting to a semi-final in the World Cup and then a final in the European Championship, it's still left people lacking that inspiration. I think that has a lot to do with the managerial choice. It's a lot to do with the way we play. And we've got a golden generation of players here that unfortunately I think we're not getting the best from because the manager is simply not good enough. And that needs to change, in my view, as well. Let's go to, he says, he puts in capital letters, watching from Poland and Warsaw. Why are we not going for a striker? What is happening? I mean, in regards to the striker targets, we've talked about it before. There are simply not profiles, the obvious candidates out there that Arsenal are able to go for during this window. You can see people shouting and screaming elsewhere or typing furiously onto social media. Why are we not going for Isak? Why are we not going for these players? And, those that have any semblance of reality about them, that know the reality of the situation, know that Isak is not going to be a realistic target for Arsenal during this summer window. He's closing on a new contract renewal as well, it seems, with Newcastle, which only makes it even more difficult to get him in the future. But it seems a striker has since the Sesko situation moved away from much of kind of an early deal for Arsenal. It seemed that if it would be anyone, it would be Sesko early on in the window, but he decided to stay. Means that he will stay in that position at Leipzig, and we may not look to sign somebody else at the moment unless something emerges in the coming weeks and months. Sally says, we seem to be missing out on key targets. Sesko, Douglas Luiz, Nico Williams, Zubamendi, Xerxes, Elise also look like they're going elsewhere. When should we start panicking? I don't think they're key targets. Sesko was a player that was on a list of centre forwards that I'm aware of, but it was always much further than the noise was suggesting, as to my understanding, as to what it was. Douglas Luiz, again, he was a player that was of interest to Arsenal a couple of years ago. That's not really progressed. It seems like he's going to be moving to Juventus. Nico Williams, again, a player that's been mentioned with Arsenal, but not as kind of a key target of Arsenal's. Zubamendi, they liked the player, but that ship has also somewhat moved on. Arsenal have changed their view of Zubamendi, so again, not really a key target. Xerxes was of interest, is supposedly of interest, but again, it's not progressed. And Manchester United, of course, the latest team to advance their interest in the player. And Elise, again, mentioned in the Arsenal circles, but we've never really heard or seen of much progression in that deal either. So I'd say that key targets, I wouldn't, other than Sesko, say any of these names were and are key targets for Arsenal, because the key targets for Arsenal this summer have remained relatively quiet. It's not been as obvious as 2023 when we had Declan Rice and Havertz and Timber and Raya. These were standout players, and Raya in particular, of course, we were interested for a very long time before we, made that move for him at the end of that window to sign him on loan. And we expect, of course, that deal to be made permanent this summer too. Going to Domenico says, I think we're going to have to enjoy endless transfer rumors while the Euro tournament plays out. No big moves will happen while these players are focused on the tournament. It's absolutely true. Angus says, would you consider Billy Gilmour as a potentially good signing? He seems like someone who could learn a lot from Jorginho and be an important ball retention player that would link really well with Odegaard. I'm not sure, Angus. I don't think that he's of the level required for us. I don't think he raises the ceiling, and I certainly don't think he raises the floor enough for us to consider a deal for Billy Gilmour at the moment. Jason says, shouldn't we do the right thing by Kieran and keep him whilst he's injured? We did the same with Elneny. We don't know if the situation is what the situation is at the moment, Jason. So it's difficult to know where we stand. Elneny, of course, came to the end of his contract, was injured. We gave him a new contract for a year it was very reasonable terms for Arsenal. That was the right thing. We've not reached that stage with Tierney yet. We're nowhere near that stage with Tierney at the moment. So we'll see how that injury how and when it progresses, and when we get the details of that, we can have more talks about what happens with him in the future. O Session says, first time catching a live show. Great job, TC. Thank you, mate. Very much appreciate the kind words. Benny says, why do we have to do right by players who aren't good enough for a title challenge? Because there are certain things, Benny, about the club, the class, the history, the badge. Football goes beyond what I like to call video game references, which is where, these aren't just names on a screen. These are people. And it is Arsenal and any company in the sense of going outside of Arsenal, but into the real world. It should be. It's the right thing to do. What we did with El Neni was the right thing to do. Can you be classy and considerate and ruthless? Absolutely. And Arsenal have been ruthless. You can't say Arsenal and their team have not been ruthless. I mean, look what happened with the goalkeeper department. That was ruthless decision making by the team to bring in David Raya and to upgrade on Aaron Ramsdale. So it's about that classiness that Arsenal have. And Benny says it doesn't mean that we keep them for 5 years. I mean, for example, could you give me an example of a player that we've kept purely out of consideration and not because of their contribution? Because I don't know if there's a player that's been at the club for 5 years that is purely here because of us being considerate of them. There's been a number of reasons as to why players, if you want to use El Neni as an example, El Neni was, you think about not so recently ago, we were going to Old Trafford with El Neni starting in a midfield that won at Manchester United for the first time since 2006 in the league. So El Neni doesn't fall into that category if you're talking about 5 years. But I'd love to hear an example of a player that we are doing that with. Dennis says, watching from Norway, like the idea of Onana, get it done early. It doesn't seem that Onana is one that will be happening from what I'm told. Big says, our medical department has been really good lately. Kieran Tierney staying here will probably be the best thing for his rehabilitation as well. Let's go to Troy says, good morning, Tom, and the TGT family. Good morning to you. And Sally says, why are we not looking at Conor Gallagher? He's Chelsea's best player, and he's homegrown, available, can play 8. Seems like a no-brainer. I've said before on the channel that I'm open to the idea of Conor Gallagher. I like Conor Gallagher as a player. I think he would provide good balance to Arsenal's midfield. Again, no noise surrounding that deal, and Chelsea would ask for a significantly higher fee from us than they would from potentially other teams as well. It's worth pointing out. Baron says, Arteta has earned the trust of the board and Edu, so if he wants Neves, trust me, Edu will pull the trigger. And I think that obviously he's earned the trust of the majority, the large majority, 99%, I would say, of the fan base too. I think that what they've done with the squad, the recruitment, the way in which we've moved forward and built this team to compete in 2 successive title races, we have been in a position where we have to put faith in them. You have to have that trust. You have to have that understanding that we are in the right place. We are moving in the right direction, and we are making decisions in the market that have contributed to Arsenal again being an elite side competing for the biggest and best trophies around. And I think some people still take that for granted, but I certainly don't. Amaral Gooner says, all you need to do is look at the players that have left, but don't talk about us in a bad way. And that's why we're class. Paul says, we bought Tierney and he was injured. He's been perpetually injured. He was injured on loan and is injured again. Will he have a sale value? Probably not at this point either. I don't think necessarily we're going to get any money for him for this window if indeed this injury is quite a significant one. Vanajit says, are you surprised that Isak is happy to stay at Newcastle without European football? As an elite player, you would think that he would want Champions League. It depends on loads of factors. People forget that these players are people, and you can have your preferences. You can have a family that might be settled where you are, and that you may have, your family and kids. I don't know Isak's personal situation, but you have to talk about these people not as names on a sheet, but you have to talk about them as people. And if someone's happy to be where they are, they're happy to be where they are. I think there's also an understanding on his side that he knows that Newcastle aren't going to accept a low fee for him, and the fee that he is, ironically and perhaps counterintuitively, even if you like, raised his level to, has meant that it's in some ways his great form has trapped him at Newcastle, because they can now, of course, demand such a massive, massive fee should they want, or even if they were ever open to selling him. Fuad says, as an expat Brit living in Denmark, I'm going to need England to do the job tonight. Otherwise, it's going to be a long week for me. Looking forward to watching it on the big screen in Copenhagen. Just don't celebrate too loudly, Fuad, I guess, if England do the job. Dennis says, would love you to be open for Onana if it was to happen. Again, I'm open to any player proving me wrong. I just don't think Onana is the right player for Arsenal. The Wiki Tiki says, respectfully to Sally's comment about Conor Gallagher earlier, it says Chelsea are not good. If Gallagher is their best player, that doesn't mean as much as it used to. We're trying to win the league here. I would point out to you, Wiki, that Arsenal, of course, when they signed Kai Havertz from a pretty poor Chelsea team at that point as well. And yet Kai Havertz has helped progress Arsenal's hopes of being title challengers. So I think there is evidence to suggest perhaps that maybe you're a bit too premature in ruling out a move for Conor Gallagher. Amaral Gooner says, maybe like players that joined us, he sees the process at Newcastle and is happy with it. Yeah, it's a really good point. Maybe he sees where his club are looking to go. Maybe where he sees things, he sees Newcastle and him at Newcastle competing for the biggest trophies. And that's also something to take into account. Sam says, please, no more Chelsea players. We are helping them with their FFP, and I don't want that. Rivalry points. Again, I will never, ever put myself into a position where I'm making decisions for Arsenal based upon my hatred or dislike towards other teams and other rivals of Arsenal in a fan sense. I would never put myself into those positions. Arsenal are bigger than anyone, and my love for Arsenal is always going to be bigger than my dislike or rivalry hatred towards any other team. So if bringing Conor Gallagher helps Chelsea, but ultimately it helps Arsenal more, that's all that matters to me. I just want Arsenal to be, pushing ourselves forwards. And Sam says that he's only playing, but I still think it's an important point because I know some people do think that way. Harvey says, if those mentioned earlier aren't our key targets, who are the key targets? And Harvey, the answer is at the moment that they aren't looking too obvious to us. As I said at the start of the show, Arsenal's transfer business this summer is one of the most unpredictable that we've ever seen going into a window. That there isn't a Ben White, there isn't a Declan Rice, there isn't a Gabriel Jesus. There aren't these key targets that Arsenal have had. And the European Championships and Copa America being on this summer, of course, make that situation even more volatile, even more unpredictable. And that's fine. Just because the media and, people like myself aren't clued in necessarily this summer as much as we have been in previous summers about who Arsenal's number one targets are at this moment in time, it doesn't mean that Arsenal aren't doing really good work in the background. That they don't have key targets, that they don't have lists of players. I am aware of a list of players for centre forward, for instance, that did include Sesko on it, that did include Gyökeres on it, for example, but I don't know of other names on that list, and I don't know the order of the names on that list either. So what is interesting is, of course, how Arsenal and when Arsenal will strike for the players that they want, but it may be after these summer tournaments. So for those that are panicking, for those that are calling on Arsenal to desperately get players in now and panic sign already, and it's only the 20th of June, those views are not beneficial to Arsenal. They're not conducive of people that really know what they're talking about. So when it comes to Arsenal, their recruitment has been savvy, it's been measured, it's been well planned and strategized, and we have to give them the benefit of the doubt at this moment in time, considering where that recruitment has taken us as a team into the top level of teams in Europe at the moment. Ant says, am I wrong wanting England to exit early so Saka gets a rest before the start of the season? Depends how you view things, mate. I mean, I'm always an Arsenal fan first and foremost before my country. I know England, for me, I've lost the sheen, lost the shine. I still am an England fan and I want England to succeed and I hope England win the Euros, of course. But my priority is always going to be Arsenal. So I know some people are different and you're entitled to be different. You're entitled to, and also you should respect people's choice of whether they want to be more inclined to be back in their club over their country. That's, you're entitled to support what you want to support. So no, and I don't think you're necessarily wrong for that. But certainly I hope that from my perspective, at least, England do go on to succeed and that Southgate can prove me wrong. Praktika says, but Tom, we want our shiny new toys right now. So many people are in the same boat as that, mate. Cross Junkie says, unfortunately, Tierney has become another Diaby. Play one game out for 6 months. It's such a shame. It is a shame. And I think that's the key thing is there's a real empathy towards Tierney. There's a real empathy towards his situation and the sadness that we have because we know that he can be a good player. We know that he can be a top professional. And sadly, injuries have let him down and have undermined his career so far. Wiki says, let's not use Onana's name against us as a benchmark. Over the course of the whole season, he's been relatively average. Even when he has been fit, he was benched by Guehi, Papa Guehi, and Garner and Decore. I think Onana's had a very decent season, to be fair. I wouldn't say he was average. I think he's considerably above average. I just don't think that he is of the level that I'm looking for stylistically, profile-wise, for an Arsenal central midfielder. Izu says, Tom, if you could sign one, who would you sign? Musiala of Bayern or Rodrigo of Madrid, and why? Musiala, without question. I think Musiala is more talented. I think he's of a higher level. I think he, for me, demonstrates a more consistent style. I think he would fit into Arsenal's team on the left or the right or through the middle. He's more versatile than Rodrigo, and I think all of that is a clear and obvious reason why Musiala would be the better candidate. Chunho says, Tom, do you think our tough start will speed up our transfer dealings? We definitely need our signings in early to be prepared for the new season. I hope it does. But again, it's impossible to know about the whole speed upping of the speed upping. That's not a word. The acceleration. That's the right word. It's impossible to know if our plans are being accelerated because we don't know when Arsenal were going to be able to strike at the targets they want to go for. You know, it may have always been the plan to go early and try and bring in players just after the European Championships and the Copa America have concluded or as they start to conclude. So we don't know if plans will be accelerated because of the fixture schedule. It may always have been that they wanted to go early for players and will aim to go early for players. So it's all about that context, isn't it? It's difficult to know. Cam says, I love how Arsenal are keeping their potential summer targets under wraps. I know it's a nightmare for speculators and impatient fans, but grab a box of popcorn and get a seat next to me. Indeed. I love that, Cal. Phil says, Tom, I've got a strange feeling that Villa and Chelsea are helping each other out by buying each other's players due to them being close to breaching their PSR rules. Interesting, isn't it? Ian Martson on his way to Aston Villa, it seems, for upwards of £35 million. Another example of Chelsea, of course, sending one of their players on loan, having a very good season at a very good level with Borussia Dortmund. Naturally, you're seeing some Arsenal fans turn around saying, why aren't we sending our players to Borussia Dortmund? I'll give you the answer. They're not good enough. And I hate to say that, and I don't want to be talking about our players like that, but that's the reality. We haven't got, a kid coming through the academy that was getting into the first team that is as good as Ian Martson. And so for that reason, we haven't been able to send them on loan to the likes of Borussia Dortmund. We hype up players like, Brooke Norton-Cuffy and Charlie Patino, but ultimately these players are going to the Championship. That's where they're going to get their loan experience. They're not going to Champions League finals. And that is a difference. And that's where we look at the academy and think, do things need to improve? How do we improve them? We need to source talent better. We need to try and bring in some young talent at a better standard, at a better level. And ultimately, that's going to be the way forwards. And hopefully, Per Mertesacker will be leading the charge in that sense as well. Benjamin says, Tom, what's your dream signing of the window? It is Isak. Without question, Isak would be the dream signing of the window for me. But again, dream signings are not realistic, and that's a frustration. Ike says, first timer here, welcome. Why don't we rate Mika Biereth? He isn't as bad as we think. I mean, I think a lot of us here rate Mika Biereth, but at the end of the day, his level that he's performed at in Austria is decent, but it's still not going to be of a level that's going to see him progress into a team competing for a Premier League title. The teams that are being linked to at the moment are, again, Sturm Graz, who would like him on a permanent deal, and other Championship teams. And that's the level. So let's not be naive about the level that these players performing at whilst doing decent at that level as well. Rifat says, look at the squad that Real Madrid has, and I think that they just lack a good centre-half, Tom. Do you think that Madrid will come for Saliba sooner or later? I've said on this channel for years that I think one day, I say years, he's still relatively young, the last 2 to 3 years, I would say, that one day the talent that Saliba had was always very obvious. And the last, this season just gone, the season before that, we has obviously seen that Saliba has raised himself to a level where one day, yes, Real Madrid will come calling, I think, for William Saliba. Nizakit says, hi, Tom. Could you see Arsenal going for a Premier League experienced player like a Sterling or Fernandes? Bruno Fernandes? Bernardo Silva, Jota. Arsenal have always, under Arteta in recent seasons, been very keen to add Premier League experience. So I'd be surprised if we didn't see a player that's at another Premier League club potentially come through the doors at Arsenal. The question is who, and I don't have the answer to that question right now because it doesn't seem too obvious. Benjamin says, do you think that we're going to prioritise a winger and 8 now that Sesko re-signed with Red Bull Leipzig? I think that, as I wrote in my article the other day, Arsenal aren't going to act rashly. The midfielder was always the priority and has been the priority. Whether it's an 8 or a 6 will be determined by, of course, the targets that emerge over the next few weeks and next couple of months. But hopefully they can get in the player that they need. I'd love to see Arsenal go for a winger. I think a wide forward is important to bring in that competitive rotation for Bukayo Saka. I'd love to see Xavi Simons personally. But I don't, again, think that's particularly realistic from the context of Simmons' situation. Anne says, but you don't know that, Tom. The club might be planning to keep him, give him another and increase his value. Talking about Beereth. You're right, Anne. I don't know. I don't know what is going on with Beereth specifically to a T. But what I do know is that a lot of clubs are very interested in him. And I do know that the club are open if indeed they get an offer of a considerable value to accept. So to a degree, no, I don't know 100% what's going to happen with Mika Beereth, but I am still very well informed about what's going on with Mika Beereth, and the club are open if indeed they get a considerable offer from a team that are interested in him. It doesn't have to be Sturm Graz. It could be one of the teams that are interested in the championship. We will wait and see what happens. Reece says, I feel we need a goal-scoring centre midfielder. I don't think Rice offers that. Havertz and a goal-scoring centre midfielder is a partnership that will flourish. I think at Rice at number 6 is the best for us. I think that Rice is showing that he can score goals. I think he's progressed significantly this season compared to previous seasons with West Ham. Goals is something that he wants to improve on, and I think it's something that Arteta wants to see him improve on. And if you were to ask me what I think will happen with Rice, not what I would like to happen with Rice, is I'd personally like to see him become our Rodri and be that 6. I would like Arsenal to go for a box-to-box midfielder personally and play ahead of him, and it's just a problem of who. I think that Rice will become the 8 for Arsenal. I think Arteta sees him as that 8 for Arsenal. I think that is where he will ultimately develop further for Arsenal. I could be wrong, but that's the indication, and that's certainly the inference I get from what we're seeing from Rice at Arsenal at the moment. So Nicholas says, Tom, what does the phrase "you can't have your cake and eat it too" even mean? When was the last time you got a cake and couldn't eat it? Look, this obviously gets used a lot with footballing analogies as well, of not having your cake and eating it too. I absolutely understand. It's a weird English phrase. I don't really get it either, but it's just one of those. We all know what it means in the sense of, you can't have one thing, but also another thing at the same time that, contradict one another. But there's nothing contradictory about getting a chocolate cake and eating it too. Izzy says, Jadon Sancho is £40 million. Don't you think it's a good bargain for Arsenal? Not necessarily. It comes with a significant amount of risk. We've seen his success in the Bundesliga. We've not necessarily seen that take place in the Premier League. Does Arteta have a good track record of improving players that, previously weren't necessarily showing their best? Absolutely. And we've seen that with Kai Havertz. But there's no guarantee. So it's a risk. And maybe I'd like to see Arsenal go for a wide player that's more so a right-sided player as well. Whereas I think Sancho, for me, is more better on the left. But I'd like to see Arsenal go for more of a right-sided player that can bring us more competitivity with Saka. Tiger says, afternoon, Tom, do you know why the transfer market is open a month after the fixtures have finished, as they do transfers during the January period as well? It's a good question about why the transfer window is open for a certain period of time and why it closes after the season starts, etc. And because you have that January period as well. Some people would suggest that a transfer window should be open non-stop. Some people should think that we should only have one transfer window and not two, and that it should close before the season starts. There's lots of opinions about how the transfer window is opening and closing and when it is and how it works. I personally think that the window should close before the season starts. I think that your team should be in a position where you have the time to get it ready for the start of the new season, and once it started, it should close, because teams that you've played at the start of the season, why should they be able to bring in players to use against teams that you've not played? It doesn't lend itself to the most sporting fairness, I think, across the season. January windows are interesting. I think obviously maybe we should look into something more like emergency transfers, which happen when teams have significant injuries, but it's difficult to police that type of thing. Cam says Arteta's post-season comments felt like that he's getting his operating scalpel out. We have some serious surgery incoming during the summer. I absolutely think you're right there. Stillia faces, I think we can win the Premier League without a 25 goal a season goal scorer, but we can't win the Champions League without one. Need the killer instinct that competition desires. Maybe we've got one. I really don't think that. Kai Havertz is getting the credit that he potentially deserves, and that is that of a player that scored 13 goals despite playing 2/3 of the season in midfield. If he was playing the whole season up front, I think we could have a 20+ goal per season goal scorer on our hands as well. James says, hi Tom, why do you never read out my comments? Thank you, James, for your comment. Paul says, it comes from baking. The expression comes from the 17th century of you can't have your cake and eat it too. The baker can't eat the thing he's supposed to sell, as he'd go bankrupt. Well, there you go, Paul. with the English phrase, giving us the reason behind that saying. Oh, there you go. You're absolutely right. A baker cannot eat the cakes that he makes or she makes. And it's important that you don't eat your stock. It's really, really important. Obo says, I think before the transfer window, a top side should have a player in mind and go all out as a season transfer window opens. Arsenal looks indecisive. I mean, that's exactly what they've done in previous seasons, but you can't have that every summer. Situations change, contexts change, and sometimes the market does not present itself with immediate options. It doesn't make Arsenal look indecisive at all in terms of what they're doing this summer, because you also want to be correct in what you do. If you want to be rash and you want to make quick decisions, then feel free. But I think you'll end up looking a bit more like Chelsea and a lot less like a club that is competing for a title with astute, savvy, measured business strategies, which is exactly what Arsenal have done. Let's go to Arsenal says, do you acknowledge that Arsenal has a lockdown on English journalists and no one knows what they're doing? Every club does. Every club does not give out every single detail about its transfer business. It's just the way it goes. Journalists will speak to intermediaries. Journalists will speak to agents. Journalists will speak to clubs to get clarity on things. It's part of the process of reporting stories that you want to double, triple, quadruple source stories. You're never going to know the full story. That's just the way it works. But what journalists can provide is an insight into what's going on to a certain degree, but are never going to be able to give the full story because clubs are not going to want to do that. Why would a club want to give anybody all the insights about what they are doing? Sometimes you get leaks, and certainly you get ITKs that hide behind, anonymous accounts because they're able to give out information that journalists can't, because journalists have their names to stories, which makes things more difficult. If you don't have your name to something, it's much easier, much more risk averse to put out those types of stories. So you can have your friends in clubs and stuff like that can leak information to you and put it out without your name being associated with it for, I don't know, clout, money, whatever it brings. But ultimately, if your name's not next to it, it doesn't hold that same level of weight. So you have to be measured and you have to be considerate in the stories that you're ultimately putting out. But of course, there's always going to be an element of the unknown surrounding what clubs do, because they don't want everything to be out there. But it doesn't mean that stories and scoops aren't still gettable, which they certainly are. Damien says, buy extra ingredients. You can bake yourself some extra cakes too and build the cost of the ingredients into your sale price. I mean, we're going into cake baking business now. This is the part of the show where we go off on a tangent. It gives me the indication that we need to bring things to a close. So that's exactly what we're going to do. Thank you so much for tuning in. Really appreciate your time as always. Have a fantastic rest of your Thursday. You've really nearly made it to the weekend. And if you are enjoying the England game later, let's hope that they can bring it home and then enjoy a very, very good indeed game between Italy and Spain. Right before, of course, tonight's very important tribute show over on the Highbury Squad, 9:45 UK time. I'll be there. Some familiar faces will be there too. It'd be great to see the TGT family represented in the chat box as much as we can. So please do jump over to that as well. I appreciate your time as always. Have a fantastic day. Stay safe, stay well, stay happy and respectful. And as always, up the Arsenal.